Today, I want to talk about the literary concepts of proactive protagonists and reactive protagonists. Now, this can be somewhat of a complex concept to explain, especially because the characters of these stories aren't necessarily locked into these roles for the duration of the narrative. A reactive protagonist can become a proactive protagonist halfway through a story, and vice versa. So I want to break this down into the simplest terms possible. In all character interactions, there are two parts: the action and the reaction. These terms help us identify what side of the dynamic our protagonist usually falls on. If a character actively decides to go on an adventure on their own, with little to no outside forces pressuring them to do so, they would be a proactive protagonist. If a character goes on their adventure either without choice or only agrees after being presented with serious consequences, they are a reactive protagonist. Another way to identify the difference between these characters is that if the proactive protagonist decides to stay home, the story doesn't happen. If the reactive protagonist decides to avoid the conflict, the story will literally come and get them. Now, there is some discourse in literary communities about whether or not reactive protagonists can be good for a story, with a lot of pieces being heavily criticized for having protagonists of this type. I personally don't believe there is any objective quality associated with these concepts. A lot of media is about a normal person being thrown into extraordinary circumstances, and their heroes, by and large, would be reactive protagonists. Of course, someone can have their opinion about the type of protagonist they prefer, but I wouldn't conflate that with objective quality. So in short, these terms are purely neutral and just to help us identify the mechanics of a piece. Now, time for some examples. Bilbo Baggins from The Hobbit is a prime example of a proactive protagonist. While the opportunity of adventure quite literally comes to his house unannounced, he's under no duress to actually come along. Also, there are points where if he wasn't there, the story would be over. They don't make it to the dragon. They get eaten by trolls. I don't know. On the flip side, Frodo Baggins from Lord of the Rings is a reactive protagonist, for the most part. He gets the ring. Ooh, it's a bad ring. Horsemen are coming. If Frodo decided, actually I'm not going to take this ring to this volcano, I'm going home, the story still has to happen. These events would be sorted without him. But not everyone has read the 1,000+ pages of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, or watched an entire day's worth of film. Let's pick something a little more accessible. So here's a hot take: Sonic the Hedgehog is a reactive protagonist. How can that be? You may type in the comments section. Sonic even calls himself a guy that loves adventure, which is a fair point. However, loving adventure doesn't really define his place in his narratives. Sonic, when not presented with a direct threat, is either sleeping or goofing off. In Sonic Adventure, even after being presented with a direct threat, he doesn't pursue it, even after it's clear he's not necessarily done with it. He does this twice! Oh, a monster immune to conventional weaponry escapes down a sewer? Whatever. Angel Island is still falling, and we only know where 6 of the 7 Chaos Emeralds are? Nap time, I guess. In the Sonic OVA, he refuses to go to Robotropolis, even when the possibility of the end of the world is threatened. The pattern is fairly clear in Sonic media. Eggman does something bad, and Sonic tries to correct it. Action, reaction. If Sonic decided that he wasn't going to do anything today, Eggman's plan would still happen. As the inverse, the best example of a proactive protagonist in the Sonic series is Shadow. In fairness, part of this is really helped along by the fact that the only game where Shadow is the sole focal point of the narrative is a game with multiple paths, communicating that Shadow gets to actively choose what he does and doesn't do, affecting how the story unfolds. Even beyond his spin-off game, he's usually making choices reflective of a proactive protagonist. One of his missions in Sonic Forces features him enacting a preemptive assault on one of Eggman's bases. Eggman hasn't even done anything yet. Also, the mission acts as the inciting action for, the whole game? He's not even the main protagonist, and he's the driving force behind the whole narrative. Shadow humiliates Infinite. Infinite vows to never be called weak again. Action, reaction. Nowhere is this difference between Sonic and Shadow better emphasized than in Sonic Adventure 2. But wait, I hear you typing again. Shadow isn't the protagonist in Sonic Adventure 2, he's the bad guy. He's an antagonist. Okay, so this would require like 2 videos of explanation, but in short, being the bad guy doesn't make someone the antagonist. And there's this other literary term, deuteragonist, which exemplifies Shadow's role much better than antagonist. For now, let's just proceed like you agree with that, because I don't want this video to be too long. So it's clear from the start, Shadow is the one pushing the narrative forward. It's his plan to blow up the Earth with the Eclipse Cannon. He basically tricks Eggman into enabling his plan. Sonic spends essentially the whole game just reacting. If you remove him from the narrative completely, essentially nothing changes. Eggman and company still have to go to Prison Island to get 3 of the Chaos Emeralds. They'd still have to find a way to get the final emerald from Tails. But I think the best example of this difference between the two occurs while the two are on Prison Island. So these two have nearly identical stages in this part. Sonic has Green Forest and Shadow has White Jungle. Sonic's level begins after he finds out the island is rigged to explode, and reacts to this by speeding off to find a means of escape with Tails and Amy. Shadow's level begins after Rouge informs him that she is stuck in the vault with the Chaos Emeralds. Now, on the surface, this could appear reactive. However, upon closer examination, he's really under no actual pressure to save her. As far as we know, Chaos Emeralds can't really be shattered like the Master Emerald. Shadow isn't even really concerned at first. What makes him go and save her is him having a flashback to Maria's death. I'd say that's more in line with a personal, proactive choice rather than one of reaction. I mentioned earlier that characters can switch between being a proactive and reactive protagonist during a narrative, and Sonic Adventure 2 actually displays this happening at the end of the Hero and Dark stories respectively. After Sonic escapes from one of Eggman's traps meant to disintegrate him in the atmosphere, Jesus Christ, he decides to make a last-ditch effort to stop Eggman by attempting to sabotage the Eclipse Cannon core. Shadow is informed of this and goes after Sonic. Sonic is the one performing the action in this case, while Shadow is performing the reaction. This is even reflected in the names of the stages. Sonic's level is called Final Rush, and Shadow's level is called Final Chase. Rushing is an action that can be completely independent of anything outside of the person doing it, and with Chase, you gotta chase something. You can't chase nothing. Like, you can rush yourself, but you can't chase yourself. That's what I'm getting at. Now, the concept of proactive and reactive protagonists implies the existence of its inverse, proactive and reactive antagonists. This isn't really something that gets talked about much, as antagonists, by definition, aren't really the point of view characters, so you don't get the same insight, and some would say their role is defined by that of how the protagonist is written. To jump back to Tolkien's work, Smaug would be reactive, as Bilbo and company are proactive. He's not actively calling people to come and take his stuff. Sauron would be proactive. Him setting out to get the ring back is what drives the story forward. To jump back to Sonic, Eggman would be a proactive antagonist, as Sonic is always reacting to what he does. A reactive antagonist would be, well, probably most of the potential antagonists in Shadow the Hedgehog. Like, yeah, Black Doom gets the story started, but he just kind of reacts to what Shadow does the rest of the story, and Sonic can't help but to be reactive, regardless of whether he's the protagonist or antagonist. The only one I would say is a proactive antagonist in Shadow the Hedgehog is, once again, Eggman. He actively decides to become part of the narrative. Like, the story from the very beginning certainly isn't about him in any regard, but his appearance creates this driving force that sees him become the main antagonist in 4 of the endings. This, in and of itself, creates an interesting point. One would initially suspect that a proactive protagonist would have a reactive antagonist, and a reactive protagonist would have a proactive antagonist. I don't know if I said that right. However, Shadow doesn't just become reactive once Eggman shows up, he still remains just as proactive. This isn't the only time we see this in the Sonic series either. Mephiles is a proactive antagonist in Sonic 06, but Shadow and arguably Silver are still proactive protagonists. This works because, while they are both proactive characters in the story, they are pushing the story in different directions. These characters have goals that aren't entirely incompatible. yet their morals are what puts them at odds. Now, the question is, can you have a reactive protagonist against a reactive antagonist? Yes, but this isn't something the Sonic series does often, so I don't have a great example. This is better suited for things like disaster movies, pieces of media where there is an inhuman outside force, like a natural disaster or a plague, that is really driving the story forward. Some analysis of those pieces may even identify those outside forces as the antagonist and give little thought to the human antagonists reacting to it. The stories that use reactive protagonists and antagonists will generally be parables about human nature when faced with a disaster or stories of individual moral failings. You could argue that the Zombot arc in the comics does this a bit, with different characters reacting to the plague in different ways, but at the same time, the plague is kind of being controlled, so it's hard to call it an inhuman force. So until someone makes a, Sonic Telltale game about rescuing people from a natural disaster, we won't really get to see this. This isn't to say Sonic has never had a reactive antagonist. I would say both Chaos and Infinite are reactive, but they aren't really the characters driving the story despite being a large part of it. They're basically secondary antagonists, as Eggman is the one pushing the story forward. If anything, they're more just like tools. Chaos does strike out on his own in Sonic Adventure's final story, but I would argue he becomes a proactive antagonist at this point. He's not really reacting to anything, he just did this. So, I think that explains this literary concept. I don't really know how to end this, since, I was just teaching an idea and not, proving a point. Go follow me on Twitter!